an end if the Republic falls, I'm willing to bet it won't be because of cosmology. It's not going to be because a comet hits us. It won't be because of virology, the zombie virus breaks out, or something. It's most likely to be because of ideology or theology. So understanding why people are different politically, we think, is a really important question. Now, we know liberals and conservatives are different on politics, right? There's liberal points of view and there's conservative points of view. I don't think that's a shock. That's a shock. Political scientists, we have proven this. Without a doubt, we have shown that liberals have different political ideas than conservatives. Here's what might be a little bit more of a shock. Liberals and conservatives are different on all sorts of stuff that should have nothing to do with politics. Or at least when you first think about it, it's hard to find the connection between those differences and politics. So one of the things that a lot of research has shown is that liberals and conservatives tend to have different personalities. Has everybody ever heard of the 5-factor model of psychology? So like how neurotic you are, how open to new experiences you are, how conscientious you are, those sorts of things. There's a lot of research that has been done by social psychologists that shows that liberals tend to score higher in openness. They are more open to new experiences. And conservatives tend to score higher in conscientiousness. They tend to abide more by the rules. So there are personality differences between liberals and conservatives. There's also differences between liberals and conservatives on all sorts of lifestyle tastes. And what I've got up on the screen right now are the results of a study that we did here in Lincoln, Nebraska. So we randomly took 300 Lincolnites and ran them through our lab, and we asked them a bunch of questions, and included in those questions were things like, do you think that poetry should rhyme? What has rhyming poetry got to do with politics? Well, one of the things that we found is this is a correlation coefficient, and a higher number means that conservatives have more of that trait. So what we found was that conservatives were more likely to prefer poetry to rhyme, and liberals were fine with poetry that didn't rhyme. Conservatives preferred that their novels ended with a clear resolution, and liberals were more, they were fine with novels that ended with an unclear resolution where you kind of had to finish the story in your head. Conservatives thought that art should be realistic. They didn't like modern art. And liberals were more interested in sort of like, where it looks like somebody shotgunned a can of paint onto a canvas. Again, these things, this doesn't have anything to do with politics as far as we can tell, but we found that conservatives and liberals had these systematic differences. This isn't our research. This is some research done by a couple of psychologists, Carney and Jost. But what they did is they went into hundreds of people's rooms and workplaces. And what they did is they were looking at what's in the wall, what's in their drawers, what sort of books are on their bookshelves. And they found all sorts of systematic differences between liberals and conservatives. Conservatives were much more likely to have sports posters on their walls or sports memorabilia. Liberals were much more likely to have this varied set of books about multiple different topics compared to conservatives. Conservatives were more likely to have cleaning supplies in their desk drawers. So again, these aren't anything that have anything to do with, your stand on abortion or whether you think taxes should be cut or what have you. But these differences, these sort of differences in our immediate personal environment seem to systematically tag liberals and conservatives. So one of the premises of this book is differences between liberals and conservatives. In other words, our differences on politics are based in something more than politics. Something else is going on. Liberals and conservatives are different. We found all sorts of stuff, and I'm not going to bore you with all of it, but their favorite car brands to their favorite foods that they're different on. So what is it? What is it? Well, one of the things that we looked at was whether there were genetic differences. And we did this in a number of different ways. Is anybody in here a twin? Anybody know a twin? No, my dad was a twin. There's two types of twins. Does anybody know what the two types of twins are?
Identical and non-identical.
Yes, so you've got what's known as monozygotic. That's two people that come from a single fertilized egg. They are genetically identical, at least when they're born. They share 100% of their structural DNA. And fraternal twins, or dizygotic twins. And these are people who two eggs just happen to be sitting there in the uterus at the same time and they're fertilized. And they are related the same way as any other sibling. So on average, they share 50% of their DNA. That sets up a cool experiment for social scientists. We have this population where we can control their entire family background because they grew up with the same family, same time, experience the same stuff. But the big difference between these two types of twins is not their environment, but their DNA. And does everybody see that if, on average, identical twins are more alike on something, it at least provides a prima facie case that it's being influenced by genes. And what we found in repeated studies is that monozygotic twins tend to be more alike politically than dizygotic twins. One of the things that we found is that monozygotic twins raised apart in different families, say a liberal family and a conservative family, they tended to be more like each other than the families that they grew up with. So there's a strong prima facie case that there's something in our genes that leads us towards these political differences. We've also done some studies of what's known as that GWAS, that's a genome-wide association scan. Basically what that does is just look at the variation in your genome. And what actually, it was a guy named Peter Vischer who found this, is what he found is people whose genomes looked more alike tended to be more politically alike. And there have even been some studies now where it's getting down to the candidate gene stage, where we're taking sort of like a simple stretch of DNA, a gene, and actually finding it correlating with certain political attitudes and behaviors. And this sounds a little mind-blowing and maybe even a little weird, but we're not saying, this does not suggest, and I'll repeat this, this does not say that there's a gene for being conservative or liberal. Nobody is suggesting that. Nobody is suggesting that. For one thing, we haven't had enough time to evolve that sort of gene. 10,000 years ago, there weren't such things in liberals and conservatives. But 10,000 years ago, there sure as heck was something that was being passed on genetically that translates into politics in our modern environment. What we think is going on is that genes incontrovertibly, non-controversially, build biological information systems. So your DNA builds your brain. It builds your olfactory system. It builds your autonomic nervous system. All of these biological systems whose job it is to take information from the environment, process it, and kick out a response, a behavioral response or a cognitive response. And one of the things that we know is that everyone's DNA is a little bit different. One of the things that we know is that that results in these biological information systems, each being a little bit different. All of our brains are a little bit different. All of our autonomic nervous systems are a little bit different. And our hypothesis was it's this that is separating conservatives and liberals. Essentially, those differences in how we biologically, non-consciously process information pushes towards more conservative political attitudes or more liberal political attitudes. So, I mean, I don't want to sort of like jump up on my platform and give you a full-blown academic theory, but this is the short version. is genome information systems. Those biological information systems are systematically different. And effectively what that means is we respond to the environment differently. And we all know people like this, right? I mean, does anybody know a real risk taker versus a real, someone who's very risk averse? Part of that is embedded in their biology. They are predisposed to be a risk taker or risk averse. And we're kind of like saying the same thing about politics. One of the things that I want to make clear, though, is what we are not saying. We are not saying that the environment plays no role in this, that your family upbringing, your own personal experience, even your own agency, thinking through issues, that all can play a role. And nothing that I'm going to say today, nothing in the book suggests otherwise. But what we are saying is that somewhere, in that 50 to 60% of variation and political differences that we can't explain, some of it is likely to be explained by our biology. And this might sound a little weird to you, so I want to take a step back just for a second and show you how those biological information systems can have an automatic, non-conscious impact on what you think and what you do. So what I've got up here is examples just from 3 studies. The first study was done by a couple of psychologists down here at the University of Kansas. And what they did is they brought a bunch of people in a lab and they gave them a pencil, like a number 2 pencil. And they instructed them to do one of 2 things. Hold it like this, or hold it like that. And the difference there is when you do that, it activates your zygomaticus major, your smiley muscle. And this deactivates it. And then they gave them sort of like a standard psychological questionnaire survey on how happy they were. And sure enough, holding a number 2 pencil like this makes you happier than holding a number 2 pencil like that. That's purely a muscle reaction. Your biology is processing the stimulus and kicking out a response, completely outside of your conscious control or knowledge. Another one, this was an interesting one, and again, it was a couple of psychologists. Basically, they took a group of people and they either gave them a warm mug of coffee or a cold drink and had them interact with someone. And people who held the warm mug had a much more positive view of the person that they interacted with. What they didn't know is they were interacting with this, all the subjects were interacting with the same 2 people. And it depended, your evaluation of that person clearly varied with whether you were holding the warm cup or the cold cup. Again, that's your biological information systems taking in information from the environment and altering your psychological view on something. It's altering your attitude. And then the final one is, this was an interesting one, and I kind of find this fascinating. It was a set of psychologists. They just handed out resumes, like CVs, to groups of people and asked people to rate these CVs. You know, is this someone who is, you know, on a 1 to 10 scale, should we hire this person or not? What they varied was the weight of the clipboard. And it was the same CV, but if you put that CV on a heavier clipboard, people rated it higher. They literally saw it as having more gravity, more weight. Again, biological information systems churning away, processing information that affects your attitudes and behavior. So this hasn't got anything to do with our research. I'm pointing this out just to sort of like, you know, hopefully tell you that, you know, the political scientists down at UNL haven't wandered out completely into left field. There is some basis for what we're arguing here. So what I'm going to spend most of the rest of the talk talking about is a bunch of studies that we've done. Most of them are in the book, although a couple of them, you know, you're kind of getting a sneak peek view of. They came out after the book. We're looking at political attitudes, and basically it's mostly, are you a conservative, are you a liberal sort of things, and 2 biological processing systems. Your neurocognitive system, or your central nervous system, that's basically your brain. as well as your memory, visual attention, those sorts of things. And then your autonomic nervous system is essentially, this is playing a little fast and loose, but it's basically your fight or flight system. Has everybody heard of that? It's your fight or flight or rest and digest system. It's the part of your nervous system that controls things like respiration and your heart rate. It happens more or less completely outside of conscious awareness, unless you're a yogi or something. You don't wander around thinking, telling your heart, keep beating, keep beating, keep beating. It takes in information from the environment, the ANS, and adjusts your heart rate to match the environment. So we're going to take a look at how these two things sort of like correlate or predict political attitudes and behaviors. The guy in the picture there is Carl Giuseppe. He's one of our, or he was one of our PhD students. And I like that picture because he's sitting there in a brain lab going, when I was getting a PhD in political science, I never ever thought I'd be doing stuff like that. But we've actually managed to publish a bunch of these studies in academic journals, not just in the book. So let me give you an example of some of these studies. One of them, which we did with a group out in a lab in West Virginia, is we put a bunch of people in an fMRI, a functional magnetic resonance imager, basically a brain scanner, which kind of looks like that. We have one at UNL now. It's over on the east side of the stadium. But you basically pop these people in this tube, in this big magnet that goes around, and it can kind of look at which areas of your brain is lighting up. So we put people into this tube, and then we show them pictures like this. I apologize if you just ate or something. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to activate the parts of the brain associated with disgust. That's what we're doing. And the reason that we're doing that is disgust is a primary, evolutionary, very old emotion. And for a number of reasons that I won't go into, we thought if we're going to find differences in biological information processing systems that map onto politics, it's likely to do with these very old emotions that basically meant life or death in evolutionary terms. And our disgust system there is to keep us away from stuff like pathogens. Okay, so everybody get the basic idea? This is a composite brain scan of kind of what we found, and I'm not going to even pretend to be a neuroscientist. Basically, how me and my co-authors on this book have made a living over the past decade is knocking on people's labs and saying, we've got these questions, and can we put people into your scanner and you tell us what it all means? And that's kind of like the case here. I do kind of want to point out here, though, is this part of the brain here, the amygdala, it's sort of like two almond-shaped parts of your brain that hang right down back at the base. Has anybody ever heard of the amygdala before? It's involved with primary emotional processing. Some people call it the fear center. That's not exactly accurate. But what it's involved in is, this is evolutionarily old stuff. I mean, that's sort of like your lizard brain activating. And what we found was conservatives there, I mean, liberal and conservatives' amygdalas lit up, which is what you would expect when you showed them a picture like that. But conservatives' amygdalas had more activity in them. So one of the things that we found, and the imagers who did this for us, they did it blind. And they could predict, in other words, they didn't know who was a liberal and a conservative. They could predict with 90% accuracy our data on who was a liberal or conservative based on the brain pattern. And here's the cool bit. That picture that I showed you of that disgusting toilet, and one of these experiments, we showed that to people for 4 seconds. So you got a good look at it. And it's like, oh man, that is awful. In other words, we could evoke a clear disgust reaction. And the second experiment, we showed it to people for 16.5 milliseconds. You can't register that. It happens too quick. It's subliminal. Conservatives' amygdalas was still lighting up, even when they couldn't see it. And some of this was interpreted, in my view extremely inaccurately by the media as what conservatives were scats, and that's not true at all. Basically, what we think we found is conservatives are simply more aware of potential threats in their environment than liberals are. And at least to us, that doesn't sound non-controversial. I mean, look at politics today. Conservatives say, you know, immigrants pose a threat to our society, to our economy. And liberals say, no, they don't. I mean, can you at least sort of like make the argumentatively that you can connect that with some of the stuff that we're finding here? Oh, and I always like to put this up because everybody knows who this guy is, right? Colin Firth. And I always like to put myself in Colin Firth's company as much as possible. He funded a study done in London that did brain imaging. And what they found, they only had 90 people in their study, but what they found was structural differences in brains between liberals and conservatives. And one of the structural differences they found was in the amygdala, which fits with what some of the stuff that we have found. And then with the other thing up there, I don't know if you can read that, the anterior cingulate, that's a piece on the side of your brain. And basically what it is, it's involved with trying to process conflict. So if you've got stuff coming in and then you're like, is that good, is that bad, should I, shouldn't I? And essentially, this is, again, playing a little fast and loose, but what they found is liberals had big anterior cingulate cortexes, which, I mean, you know, a lot of conservatives wouldn't find that surprising. You know, they'd be saying to liberals, fish, you know, fish will cut bait. So again, it's not just us up at UNL, there are other people around the world finding this stuff too. We wanted to look at how this played out, these brain kind of differences played out cognitively. So like what you remember, what you pay attention to in your environment, what you see. And we've done a number of studies up here with a psychologist called Mike Dodd, and he has a visual eye tracker. So what this means is we can put people in a lab, we can show them something, and then we can follow exactly what they're paying attention to on the screen. So does everybody get the basic idea? So we show people images like this. So you've got 4 images, 3 nice, 1 not so nice. And what we're looking at, if you see this in real time, what you see is a dog jumping around these images. And what we were interested in is, and our a priori hypothesis was, conservatives would be quicker to jump onto that negative one because there's a potential threat there. It's not just disgust, that's potential pathogen. Somebody upchucking, this isn't just necessarily a frat boy after a kegger. This could be somebody who's sick, right? So that was what we were kind of like working with. Oops, I went the wrong way. The differences were big. Conservatives spent way more time looking at the negative image than liberals did. In fact, Mike Dodd, the psychologist we were working with, I mean, in real time, we had him watch that collage of 4 pictures for about 8 seconds, and conservatives on average spent about a second more looking at the negative image, and which doesn't sound like a lot, but Mike said in my world that's huge. That's huge. We don't see those kind of differences. He actually didn't believe it, and we replicated it on a group of adults. So at least here in Lincoln, Nebraska, these differences seem to hold. Another study that we did with Mike to see whether there are any differences in what conservatives and liberals pay attention to is we brought a bunch of people into the lab and we gave them what's known as a gaze cueing test. And in a gaze cueing test, basically what our subjects are instructed to do is there's going to be a face on the screen and a black dot is going to appear to one side of that face. As soon as the dot appears, hit the space bar. And the subjects are told the eyes in the face are going to move. Don't pay any attention to the eyes. The eyes have nothing to do with what side the dot is going to show up on. So the subjects are told the eyes have nothing to do with where the dot will show up on. So if you're a subject, it kind of looks like this. There go the eyes, there comes the dot. There go the eyes, there goes the dot. What the natural tendency is when those eyes shift to one side, if you're a subject, your eyes tend to follow the face's eyes. And you tend to be quicker to hit the space bar when the dot shows up where the eyes are looking than when it shows up when the eyes are not looking. Does everybody get that? And the gaze cueing effect is the difference between the two. In other words, how slower are you to hit the space bar when the eyes are looking away? Everybody with me? This is the difference that we found. With conservatives, there was basically no difference. With liberals, there was a big difference. The average difference was no different from what 100 other psychologists have found in hundreds of other studies. And one of the things that we think is going on, well, we think there are two possibilities. Tend to be more swayed by social cues than conservatives. So liberals tend to be more attentive to the faces and sort of like whatever information they're putting out. So if the eyes are looking that way, liberals have more of a tendency to follow than conservatives. And the other thing that we think might be going on is because of the instructions that subjects were given, conservatives simply are better at following rules. We told people, don't pay attention to the eyes. So it's possible the conservatives said, okay, I won't pay attention to the eyes, where liberals didn't follow that rule. And of course, it could be a combination of both. The bottom line, though, is we found differences in the central nervous system, systematic differences between liberals and conservatives. And we've got a number of other studies that sort of like point that out. But let me move on to the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system, I think most of the studies I'm going to talk about are with a sympathetic nervous system, which is essentially your fight or flight system. And how we measure this is we put sensors on your fingers. And what we're doing is measuring, essentially we're measuring the activation of sweat glands on your fingers. And what that gives you is a real clean measure of how your fight or flight system is moving up or moving down. Essentially what this is a real sophisticated lie detector test, is what it is. When we were setting up the lab, I had my 16-year-old daughter was one of our first guinea pigs. So we sat her down, we hooked her up, we made sure everything was calibrated. The first question I was asked her was, are you dating anybody? Anyway. Aha! But we didn't, again, we were showing people these sorts of, people are looking away. This guy, eating the worms, is actually the lead author on the book. Regents Professor John Hibbing, a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and one of the best-known political scientists in the nation. And this shows just how far he's willing to go for science. And it also shows just how willing I am to let John go for science. But we showed people these disgusting images, and what we're looking for is activation of their sympathetic nervous system. So based on some of our earlier research, what we're trying to do is saying, well, is this other biological information processing system that we know happens primarily outside of conscious awareness, can that also track onto political attitudes and behaviors? So again, we were trying to activate disgust, threat, and a couple of other things. What we did is we showed people a bunch of negative images and a bunch of positive images, and then we correlated their self-reported ideology. We correlated their self-reported stance on a number of issues with this physiological measure of disgust. So the physiological measure means it's their readings from those sensors. Okay, so it's an observed measure, and sure enough, there was a significant positive correlation. When you hit somebody with a negative image, conservatives tend to have a stronger sense that they're scared. It means that they're much more attentive to it than liberals are. And this is just an example of, we showed people a total of, I think it was 28 images. The 3 images on the left are the images that liberals were most physiologically responsive to. You notice a common theme there? They're all positive. The images on the right are the 3 images that conservatives were most physiologically responsive to. Do you notice a theme there? They're all aversive, not necessarily disgust, although spider on the face is pretty disgust, but at least potentially threatening. So again, we think that we found evidence that these biological information processing systems can systematically separate out liberals and conservatives. So what does this all mean? Let me try, I've been running through a bunch of these studies, which we get all excited about, but how does this sort of like track back to politics? This is what we think is going on. When humans get a stimulus from the environment, and it doesn't have to be a picture of a dirty toilet shown to you in an academic lab. It could be a political ad. It could be somebody talking to you about politics. It could be the thought of a candidate. It could be a yard sign. Whenever you have any kind of stimulus, as a human, you are incapable of preventing those biological information systems from whirring away and doing their thing. How those information systems get into our consciousness is through affect, through emotion. They tell us things like, hey dummy, that's a bear. You better be scared and start running. Hey, that is a blackberry bush. That's good stuff. Get over there and eat it up. What we think is going on is the same sort of thing happens with politics. We hear something, we are exposed to someone, a political candidate, a political idea, some kind of political stimulus. And what happens is we have in our biological information systems a predisposition to react to that negatively or positively. So we will react to it in some way with joy, with happiness, with anger, with disgust, with fear. It will just be a flash of affect, and we won't consciously process this. How it will be revealed to us in our political attitudes is like, I don't like that guy. I don't like that idea. Why? Oh, I just don't. I just feel it in my gut. I know it, that it's wrong. And if you actually talk to people, you just sit down and talk to people about politics and political attitudes, that's how a lot of people think about politics. It's like, who did you vote for? I voted for Trump. Why did you vote for Trump? Oh, because he's going to do great things for the nation. Like what? And when you strip it all down, it's like, well, I kind of like the guy. I mean, I can't explain why, but I kind of like the guy. Well, we think we can explain why. And there have been a number of studies that sort of like back this conception of politics being rooted in emotion, that in turn is rooted in subconscious information processing, and studies like the one that I've got briefly summarized up here. If you put people in a room and ask them their attitudes on global warming or climate change, and psychologists have actually done this. If I wasn't a political scientist, I'd be a psychologist, because you can mess around with people so much. And you start playing around with the thermostat, you can change their attitudes. If you make that room really hot, they become more inclined to believe in climate change. You put it down to a nice, comfy 68 degrees, and they become less inclined to believe in climate change. And all of that is their information processing systems recognizing the temperature change, completely outside of their conscious awareness, and yet it's clearly affecting their attitude. And in this case, that is a political attitude. And this is what we think we're explaining. So, just to sort of like start to sum things up, what we think is going on is we've got these genetic differences that result in differences, systematic individual level differences in these biological information processing systems. These are whirring away all the time, and they sort of like creep into our consciousness as flashes of affect, of emotion. You get a gut level response to something that is good or bad. It's something that you want to support. It's something that you want to oppose. The result of all this is that people wander around opposed. They are predisposed to be more responsive to certain stimuli, and that could be novels, it could be art, it could be food, it could be sports, it also could be politics. They're predisposed to engage in approach or avoidance behavior, or positive or negative attitudinal responses based on how their biology is processing that stimuli and shooting up an emotional signal. That may at least kind of make sense. So when most people think about politics, they tend to think that politics is played out in a rational sense, at least in the sense of a rational winner-loser. I am calculating pros and cons. I'm voting on the basis of my own self-interests. When it comes to tax cuts, I'm thinking about, is this good for me? Is it good for my city? Is it good for the state? Is it good for the country? And what we're saying is, maybe, and certainly for some people, but for the vast majority of people, we don't think that's going on at all. We think politics isn't grounded, is at least as grounded in emotionality as it is in rationality. And if you look at what's going on in the country right now, which is, it's a fascinating time for us because we think what's going on in the country right now kind of makes our point for us. You know, people are really mad at each other and yelling and screaming. But when you get right down to it, a lot of those can't really explain what they're so mad about or what they're so happy about. And one of the consequences of this is that this is, if we're correct, the bad news here is it's going to make it really hard to resolve political differences. Because most people seem to believe is, if only I could get, if you're a liberal, it's like, if only I could get a conservative here and talk to them and show them the facts, they would agree with me, or they're at least meet me halfway. And if I'm a conservative, it's like, if only I could get a liberal here and shake them and you know, expose them to the facts, the real story, they'd agree with me. And what we're saying is, probably not. Liberals and conservatives literally see the world differently. And the further you get away from the middle, the more and more different the world looks. I mean, that's the clear implication of our research. So, you know, these kind of books, essentially what they're doing is they're just speaking to the converted. What they're doing is people who consume, you know, Ann Coulter's books or Al Franken's books, what they do is they get a big emotional reward from that. You read Ann Coulter's book, it's like, yeah, those stupid liberals, I hate them. You read Al Franken's book, it says conservatives, they're so dumb. That's not going to convert anybody. That's not going to convert. That's not going to convert anybody. What we are doing is we're not saying that we can convert anybody, but what we're saying is that we think that we can explain why politics is like this. And at least part of the reason why politics is the way it is because of our biology and its influence on our deep fundamental psychology. And if we don't understand that, and right now we barely understand it at all, we barely scratched the surface, there's no way that we're ever going to be able to sort of like seriously solve issues like the Middle East, for example, where those kind of conflicts and hatreds have been going on for literally millennia. But if we do understand more of this sort of stuff, that knowledge would at least give us a fighting chance of figuring out ways to resolve these terrible conflicts. One of the things that I want to point out, and the reason that I've got all these faces up here, is I just want to point out that the sort of research that we're doing you can't do with 1 or 2 or 3 people. It requires a lot of people working in collaboration right around the world. So this is the University of Aarhus. He's our primary European collaborator. That's John Rice, John Alford at Rice University, co-author on the book. That's Mike Dodd here at UNL, who helped us with all the visual attention stuff. Jeff French at UNO, he's an endocrinologist. I didn't talk about the endocrinology, but that's pretty cool stuff too. Pete Hatemi at Penn State, Nick Martin at Queensland Institute of Medical Researcher. He's a primary guy we've collaborated with in Australia. And this is my partner in crime, of course, John Hibbing. And then I'll stop there and let you ask Q&A. But if anybody wants to sort of like stay up on this stuff, or sort of like, you know, kind of like stay in touch, I don't know if you guys can read this, but I'm on Twitter. I'm hip. You know, my kids don't believe it, but I'm at UNL Poli-Sci Guy. And I also write a blog called polysciguy.com. Fair warning, though, if you get on my blog, I don't care if you're a liberal or conservative or moderate, sooner or later I will offend the snot out of you. So fair warning, don't go there to get your political viewpoints validated, because I don't care what they are, I'll come down on them hard at some point. But my undergraduates seem to really like the blog because it gives me a way to write in kind of like a silly way without being too academic. But I'll stop right there, and if there's any questions, I'll certainly try to provide answers. Yeah, Nick?
I was wondering on the visual thing where you said the 3 most positive ones were, or the 3 most responses. The most intense response was for positive for liberals and negative for conservatives. But I was wondering, like, if you were to look at like absolutely, for those same positive images, are conservatives, are they responding more highly than the liberals? So is it like absolutely?
Oh, yeah. Actually, that is a really good question, and I need to be careful about the answer here, because one of the critics of that, of some of the research that I presented, well, actually, it's sort of like a lab, and they've made the strong argument that it's not that conservatives are more responsive to negative or aversive or disgusting images. Conservatives are more responsive to stimuli, period. We haven't found that in our data. Some other people are suggesting that that is the case. So that's kind of like an empirical issue that has to be resolved. And when I said we're like just scratching the surface, this entire research agenda is less than a decade old. And in academic terms, that's barely out of the womb. I mean, that's really young. Yes?
I'm curious, did you discover any differences when you're talking about the paternal twins between male and female? And also at birth order, when you said that conservatives follow the roles. Well, I'm a firstborn, so I follow the roles, and the answer that, or did that not enter into?
It did enter into it. Well, let me take the second part of the question first. Birth order, essentially how we handle that, when we analyze these things, we're looking at relationships between twins, and we randomly assign birth order. So they can be either on, so basically we're holding birth order constant. With gender differences, there can be gender differences because there are chromosomal differences between males and females, and genes can take a ride on those chromosomal differences, and we do find those differences. But when you're talking about just broad political orientation, we haven't found a whole lot of those, but on particular political attitudes, they tend to be more heritable amongst primarily females than males. And one of the other things that we found is age. The genetic influence on your political attitudes varies by age. And some people have taken that as evidence, well, that can be. Well, of course it can be. Your genes don't have to influence you in exactly the same way throughout your lifespan. It can vary. And basically what we found is that your genes tend to have the least influence on your political attitudes when you're 18 to 24. And progressively, as you get older, the genetic influence gets more and more and more. So So the question that you're asking is a really important one, and we have looked at some of those differences, and that's kind of like the Cliff's Notes version of what we found. Yeah.
How about class, culture, and ethnicity? Did you look at those?
We control for things like income. We are limited in the, especially with like culture, because basically what we're dealing with are twin registries when you're looking at genetic influence, and they tend to be, like one of the twin registries that we work with is the Minnesota Twins Registry, which is a bunch of twins that were born in Minnesota, and that's a fairly limited cultural range. How we try to look at cultural differences is, this is why we were working with Nick Martin. He works with a big twin registry in Australia, and we can kind of do those kind of comparisons. But the only honest answer to your question is, we've tried to look at that, but some of the limitations of the data prevent me from making any strong statements one way or the other. One of the projects that we're working on right now is we have samples from the United States, Australia, Denmark, Hungary, Germany, and we're collecting it in Mexico. And what we're looking at is to see whether there's uniform findings across all of those. And if we find that, then I'll be able to make a much stronger case about cultural differences. But until we do things like that, I would suspect yes, but to what extent, I don't know. Yeah.
I have a question about just the overall numbers. Are the two groups like the same percentage of people within the population, or is there a bigger number of liberals versus conservatives, or conservatives versus liberals?
Yeah, some of that depends upon where you are, certainly what country you're in. Like in Denmark, it's kind of hard to find conservatives as people in America conceive of a conservative. In Lincoln, Nebraska, it's easy to find conservatives. In California, it can be harder to find conservatives, and the reverse is true for finding liberals. This is why one of the things that's really important about this research, we tend to bring fairly small groups of people into the lab. So like 50 to 300. 300 is a big group for us. That's a fairly small group of people. Now, what we find with those 300 people, I'll defend to the death. In other words, it has internal validity. Whether what we find with those 300 people, does that travel everywhere around the world, or even everywhere around the United States, we have to rely on other labs replicating our work to figure that out. And replications are just now kind of starting to roll in. And some of the replications are holding up, and some of them look a little bit more shaky. Like the visual attention stuff looks pretty solid. That looks pretty solid. The physiological response to the disgust, one lab tried that and didn't get it. And then we just heard of another lab that tried it and did get it. So, it stinks to be an empiricist because data doesn't always do what you want it to do. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to ask, I noticed that we have all men researchers. I'm just wondering, what about women researchers? Do you have them, some of them, and do they have a different perspective a little bit? Or?
We do have some female researchers because we've been very attuned to training them. One of my PhD students, Amanda Friesen, who's now at Indiana University, Purdue, and is interviewing a job for the Danish Institute of Science, is probably one of the prominent ones. She's done quite a bit of research on specifically like political attitudes as they are tied to religion. So she's kind of like interested in religious conservatives. But yeah, you're right, and it's not just males, it's primarily white guys. And we've noticed that, but we're genuinely not trying to exclude anybody. In fact, we're trying to be proactive in terms of, especially in training our PhDs and being as diverse as we can. So yeah, that I wasn't leaving a group of people out. We're just, we're a bunch of middle-aged white guys. Yeah.
explain a little bit about family background. My husband's set of grandparents came from Russia and Poland, and they left because of the caste distinction. So I'm very left-wing. My brothers are, my whole family. And so historically, doesn't that mean something?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, the question is what does it mean? It could mean a couple of things. I mean, what you've just explained is 100% compatible with the notion that there's some genetic influence on political attitudes. And it could have even been, you know, some of these differences could have been driven by class differences that are very, very old and ingrained. But there's also an element that it could be socialized there, right? If you're from the lower classes, and you know the upper classes are oppressing you and keeping all the wealth and leaving you with the dregs, I mean that certainly I would think could influence your political attitudes to where you aren't that crazy about elites, and you tend to have a more left-wing, sort of like social democratic or even socialist sort of orientation. So yeah, absolutely, that could play into it. The PhD student I was just talking about, Amanda Friesen, part of her PhD work that she did, she got a 3-generation survey in Nebraska. So she started with students at UNL and worked back and surveyed their parents, and then worked back and got as many of the grandparents she had. So she could do what's known as a pedigree. She could look at attitudes across generations. And what she found, I mean, sure, there's exceptions. I mean, everybody knows a conservative family where all of a sudden a Birkenstock wearing tree hugger gets thrown out, or a very liberal family where you get kind of like this Alex Keaton conservative coming out of it. But mostly what she found is that political orientation tended to be very stable. And one of the things that I'd be fascinated to follow up on this in 20 years, because the parents and the grandparents were more alike and the kids were more different. And my a priori hypothesis would be come back in 20 years and those kids are going to be more like the parents and the grandparents than they are now. Yeah.
So on that point, to what degree are people persuadable?
Oh, that's a really good question. The sort of conclusion that we can't run away from, that is implied by our research, is that persuasion is going to be tough. But it's not impossible. It's not impossible. Nothing in our research denies agency, that you cannot consciously and rationally engage in a discussion and talk your way to a different position. But our research does imply that's going to be really hard. The other thing that gives us hope is that if people are really convinced that there are biological differences, that we see the world differently, that it will make them more tolerant of views other than their own. And we see this most clearly with attitudes on gay marriage, for example. The more Americans believe that sexual orientation was genetically influenced, and this is really clear in the Gallup surveys, the more likely they were to support gay rights. So we think that if liberals and we've done a couple of national surveys, and we basically asked, you know, to what extent do you think people's political attitudes and behaviors and orientations are biologically influenced? It's like 5% of people think biology has anything to do with it. And what we're hoping is that as that percentage increases, the tolerance will increase with it, and we'll see if that is the case or not. But yeah, there's no easy answer to that.
I have the impression now that there also comes sort of, and I don't mean to be offensive, but there seems to be self-righteousness for all of us that comes with our own point of view, and that part of it is sort of wanting to embrace our own point of view by looking down on the other point of view, and I think that goes both ways.
Yep.
So I'm just curious about that aspect also, if there's a way to measure that.
One of the pieces of research that we've been involved in, although it's primarily been undertaken by Dan Kahan Dan at Harvard or Yale, one of the big snooty Ivy League schools. You know, one of the hypotheses that seems to make sense is that people who were more knowledgeable and smarter and more informed, they would be more likely to be the ones who would be like, well, we got to cut a deal here. We have to move towards some compromise. And the evidence is pretty clear. That's not what happens. Basically what it is we use our smarts to defend our, to dig in our political heels. So we tend to have this subconscious response, you know, this gut feeling of I'm pro-Trump or I'm anti-Trump, whatever. And then everything after that, we're using our smarts force to rationalize that initial response. And one of the things that we're interested in is there any way, are there ways that you can interrupt that? And we haven't done that research. We haven't done that research yet. Well, funnily enough, the people who were most interested in that were the military. They came real close to giving us nearly $2 million a year and a half ago, and they didn't quite pull the trigger on it. We didn't get the money, but the reason that they were interested in it is because of terrorists and what they're dealing with. I mean, that's a big, huge question.
So this book was published a couple years ago,
Yep.
right? So I have two questions. First of all, have you noticed an increase in book sales, with the election recently? And then second of all, with all the new research that's continues to evolve, are you doing a reprint or a expanded version of the book or anything like that?
No. What tends to happen is the book sales tend to take an uptick in the fall because, and what we think is going on is professors are starting to assign the book in their class. We made a huge strategic error. If we'd have known that Donald Trump was going to run and win, we would have published this book right now because we could have retired friends on that. And we've been arguing with our publisher about bringing out a paperback and updating it, and they resisted it because the hardback is still selling well. And publishers make more money off the hardbacks than the paperbacks. So yeah, so we'd love to have a paperback come out with some updates because we've done a lot of research over the past year.
How has this influenced your personal political standing, or like the way that you, I guess, analyze your political standing? What?
You mean, do I walk the walk, not just
Yeah.
talk the talk?
Because I imagine researching something like this for such a long time, it like changes the way that you yourself interact with.
Actually, I think it has influenced my thinking in a fairly positive, or at least constructive way. Because now whenever I have a political opinion, and I have tons of political opinions, I mean, read my blog, I got a lot of political opinions, I actually tend to question, like, where did this come from? And why do I have that? You know, like most academics, I probably lean to a little left of center. I mean, I'm a conservative for a political scientist, which means I'm pretty liberal, or at least I thought so. But one of the things that I've noticed since we've been doing this research is that I have several habits or traits that clearly are more associated with conservatives than liberals. And one of the things that I've noticed, I have certain attitudes that tend to move more conservative than liberal. So it's kind of like made me rethink of what I am politically, which I think is a constructive thing. I don't care whether you're a liberal or a conservative or somewhere in between. I think it's healthy and constructive to really question your own political beliefs and why you have them. It's certainly made me more willing to, you know, I won't question other people's motivation in their politics. I won't disagree with it, but I'm like, why do you have that opinion? I don't automatically jump to, geez, you're an idiot. Like that's pretty much skipped right out of my thought process. And I think that's a healthy thing. And if the book helps anyone else do that, I think that in itself would be I'd be pretty proud of that contribution.
We're going to conclude here, and then if Dr. Smith is able to stay afterwards and answer any more questions, I don't know your schedule is, but I invite people to. So let's thank Dr. Smith for being here. we've all been here for almost 2 hours, so we've been, captivated by your talk.
Oh,
so
bless your hearts. Thanks for hanging in there. I appreciate it. And a lot of good questions too. I really appreciate that.
So I appreciate you all coming on a beautiful day. And if you would like refreshments, you can take them to go and go outside and enjoy or stick around. But thank you all for coming. This is the end of the 2015-16 NLHA year, and we'll see you all after.
Oh, you're Oh, that's great. Oh, no. Oh, actually, that's a great gift.